look at the book of Psalms, or the Psalm 1 in just a moment. We're going to be in the book of Proverbs. And I just want to reflect on last week. And I'm confident that it was a blessing for Tim and for Carol as we celebrated them. And I pray that it was a blessing for us. I mean, what an incredible reflection on God's faithfulness we walked through together as a church family. And so God was glorified, and I believe his faithful leader was honored well in our services last week and throughout the ways we celebrated. So that was good. That was really, really good. And despite his warning from a few weeks ago, we're beginning a series this morning, not on Leviticus, at least there's that, but we're beginning a walkthrough of the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs is a little different because we won't be working verse by verse, as is our normal pattern of walking through a book of the Bible. Instead, we're going to be looking at 6 different themes in the book of Proverbs. This week, we're going to introduce ourselves to the concept of wisdom. Next week, we're going to be talking about Proverbs on sex. The week after, Proverbs on work. The week after, Proverbs on wealth. The week after, Proverbs on words. Then December 15th, we have the privilege of having Oscar Chiquito, one of our missionaries, with us. And following that, we're going to have a great Christmas service on the 22nd. And then we're going to talk about Proverbs on friendship. One of the things about Proverbs is the significance of the word. How much we are in need as a people of a word from the Lord. And thanks be to God, he has given us his word so that we might know him and might know life through him. And so that's the good news of that. But why I think Proverbs is so helpful, and I honestly, this hit me yesterday, so it wasn't really a part of why I picked it, but in light of our celebration from a week ago, what did Solomon do when he stepped into the role after his dad had been such an incredible king for 40 years? And God said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Lord, this is too great. I need wisdom." And so for this season in our life as a church, it may be wise for us to think about wisdom. And as I was saying before, we're going to look at it thematically. We're not going to necessarily work through it bit by bit. But Proverbs, as you know it, is a series of both poems, but then also short sayings that speak to practical, everyday life. One of the commentators I read said that Proverbs has very little to do with what happens, in our case, on a Sunday, and a lot to do with what happens the other 6 days of the week. The first section of Proverbs is really 12 poems in chapters 1 through 9, preceded by a prologue, followed by an epilogue in chapter 9. Then you get into what we traditionally think of as Proverbs, the short sayings. From chapters 10 to 22, there are a number of sayings attributed to Solomon. Then chapters 22 through 24, what's interesting about that section is it would appear that it's a section taken from an earlier collection of wisdom sayings, but adapted through a biblical lens. The fourth section takes place from chapter 25 through chapter 29 and is a collection of wisdom from Solomon that Hezekiah the king collected. And then chapter 30 are words from Agur, and then chapter 31 is words from Lemuel, people that we don't know a lot about in terms of who they were in history. But Proverbs tells us a lot about how God has called us to live. And as we think about Proverbs, I want to give us an illustration that will kind of work through the rest of the morning. And that illustration is the game of soccer. Now, I've had very little to do with soccer in my life, but I've touched on it at different points. When I was in high school, I worked for a local park. And one of the falls, the director of the park wanted to start a soccer league for young kids, very recreational, not meant to be incredibly developmental or competitive, and he needed referees. And I was one of his guys, so he said, "Neil, could you come in on Saturdays and ref?" I said, "Sure." I had no idea what was going on. And you know, at the young ages, soccer is like swarm ball, right? So it's a mass of children. And what I found, the one thing I can remember, is that there were countless times where the swarm would happen, the ball would shoot out, and it would go out. I had no idea which little leg kicked it last. So you know what I decided? Whoever went to get it, it was their ball. I think it worked. Then when we moved up here and our kids got older, we tried soccer out, and I started to see that sort of developmental piece of soccer. When they're young, it's swarm ball. As they get a little bit older, they start working on ball handling and individual skills. Then as they move up into probably that middle school, high school age, plays start to develop. I can actually remember when I was a youth pastor in Illinois, we had a ton of students who played soccer, and I went to one of their games, and it's the first time I ever saw a soccer game and understood that they were trying to do something with the ball, work it down the sides, move it to the middle. I'd never seen that before, and it made sense how the game worked. And there's different types of player at all of these different levels. The early years are great because you have the ballerina, right? The one who's on the court twirling around, doesn't even know there's a soccer game happening. Kids in general don't know where they're going. I had a kid on one of the teams I helped coach that my goal for him was that he would touch the ball. Like it would come towards him and he'd run. So finally in one of the games, it went off of his leg and we celebrated. You did it. You hit the ball. Now as they got a little bit older, kind of the last few years I was really around it, you get the athletes, right? The ones who are a little bit better athletically. But what's interesting is they try and do it all. They don't yet understand how to work with their team. So they go. But they often aren't able to finish because they're doing it on their own. Then you get the kids who know how to do one thing. And you'll say, hey, try this. You should totally give, no, I do this. This is what I do. It might be a certain ball handling skill. It might be a certain position. But they figured out their niche and they don't want to leave. Probably not the best when you're like 8. And then during the later years, you get that mixture of kids who understand and can play the game, but also know how to be a part of a team. And so when you think about developing a soccer player, and this probably fits with a lot of team sports, what you want is somebody who understands the game. They know what to do within the team structured plays, but also when the plays aren't working, right? And lastly, they have to know what to do, understand the game, and ultimately, especially as the levels increase, they've got to be able to do it, right? Otherwise, they help coach. And here's how I want to relate that to Proverbs this morning. Proverbs is a collection of teachings and saying through which God paints a picture of how he intends us as his image bearers to conduct ourselves in everyday life. Now, he paints that picture in positive and negative examples. He talks about the righteous one, the wise ones, the upright. But he also talks about the fool, the sluggard, the wicked. And again, going off of that idea of soccer, in Proverbs, God teaches us to understand how the game, and by that I mean the world, works, and how we ought to play, and by that I mean how we ought live in the midst of the game that is our world. But Proverbs is even more so an invitation to come to him, to find in him both the understanding and the ability to do the things he calls us to do. You see, if I had to give a definition of Proverbs right off the bat, or of wisdom from Proverbs, I would say that wisdom in Proverbs is living rightly in a world that bears both the goodness of its creation and the brokenness of its sinful creatures. And the admonition of Proverbs is not just to have good information. The admonition is to be a wise person. And a wise person, according to Proverbs, knows the source of wisdom, knows the world by wisdom, and chooses to do what to do in wisdom. And that's really the three things we're going to see as we skim all over Proverbs this morning thinking about wisdom. First, I want us to think about the source of wisdom. And I'm going to take us to one of the most well-known passages in Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Probably many of you right now could say that. The fear of the Lord, Proverbs 1:7, is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so we'll come back to the introduction of Proverbs chapter 1 in a minute, but I want to begin with the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 1:7 tells us that if you want to be wise, if you want to have knowledge, where does it begin? It begins with fearing the Lord. Now, Proverbs uses the phrase, the fear of the Lord, 18 different times, or at least it's translated into English 18 different times, 17 of which is that phrase in Hebrew, fear and Yahweh, together. One time, it's another expression that says, blessed is he who shakes continuously. which is another way that translators assume is saying they fear the Lord, because it's contrasted with those whose heart is hard. But while Proverbs 1 tells us wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, Proverbs 2:5 says something quite interesting. In verse 3 of Proverbs 2, it says, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of our God. And so where does wisdom begin? With the fear of the Lord. But where does our pursuit of wisdom take us? To the fear of the Lord. Then if we fast forwarded to Proverbs 15:33, you don't have to turn there now. It says that the fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom. So where does our wisdom start? We fear the Lord. Where does our wisdom take us? To knowing the fear of the Lord. And what is it that fuels our growth in wisdom? The fear of the Lord. And the fear of the Lord throughout is defined, and the picture is filled out of what the author and what I believe the Bible is talking about. In Proverbs 1:29, the author of Proverbs, wisdom himself or herself, laments those who have heard wisdom and rejected it. And he says that the fear of the Lord is opposed to being wise in your own eyes. Proverbs chapter 8:13 says the fear of the Lord is the hatred of evil. Proverbs 9:10 parallels the fear of the Lord with knowing the Holy One. 10:27, the fear of the Lord prolongs life. 14:2, the fear of the Lord is true of anyone who walks in uprightness. The fear of the Lord, 14:26, provides strong confidence. And in the fear of the Lord, our children have refuge. 14:27, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. 15:26, a source of joy even if it's accompanied by little else. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom, as we've already said. 19:23, it leads to life and satisfaction. The fear of the Lord in 22:4 is said to be riches and honor and life. 28:14, blessed are those who again shake continually or live their lives in fear of the Lord. And lastly, Proverbs 31, in that beautiful picture of a godly wife, says that fear of the Lord in the heart of a woman is to be praised. In essence, how I would summarize what the fear of the Lord is fear of the Lord is the right response to who God reveals himself to be. One of the authors I was reading said that it's difficult if we want to break the idea of fear away from the idea of who the Lord is. But as a statement together, it's a powerful statement of the understanding of the God who reveals himself to us and how we ought to respond appropriately. And we get this. We understand this by nature. This morning I had the opportunity to greet many of you in the room. Now here's my guess. If I was not who I am, if I was wearing a police officer's uniform, you would probably say hello, but it might not have been as casual, right? Now let's say we had an opportunity to meet a political dignitary. Who they are would shape how we respond, right? How we work alongside our coworkers is different than maybe how we work alongside those in charge. The fear of the Lord understands who God is and responds appropriately. So in order to have knowledge, we must understand who God is, and we must understand how he calls us to respond. Flip now with me to Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8 is one long expression of wisdom. And it's written from the voice of wisdom herself. The idea of wisdom in Proverbs is generally depicted as a woman, partially because the word wisdom is a feminine word, and she's contrasted with the lady folly or the adulterous woman. But the lady wisdom, one of the commentators I read said, is really no different than wisdom itself. But listen in Proverbs chapter 8 to how wisdom talks about itself. Let's pick up in verse 5. O simple ones, learn prudence. O fools, learn sense. Hear, and this is wisdom speaking, for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is right. For my mouth will utter truth. Wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the words of my mouth are righteous. There is nothing twisted or crooked in them. They are all straight to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence. I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is the hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance and the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. I have counsel and sound wisdom. I have insight. I have strength. By me kings reign and rulers decree what is just. By me princes rule and nobles all who govern justly. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even fine gold, my yield than of choice silver. I walk in the way of righteousness, in the path of justice, granting an inheritance to those who love me and filling their treasuries. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of old. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. Before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits so that the waters might transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the children of man. As we listen to that description of wisdom, followers of Jesus, who do we think of? You know, the earliest interpreters of this book, in light of Jesus, said this has to be Jesus. Who else fits this description? Now, I disagree with the earliest interpreters. No, I don't think that the Lady Wisdom, as Proverbs 8, is kind of an incarnational picture of Jesus, but here's what I do think. Jesus is the perfect picture of wisdom incarnated. And so while this is not necessarily Jesus being described, this is describing the type of life that Jesus lived. But what else does this passage tell us? Wisdom exudes from who God is. Wisdom comes out of his very being. Wisdom, this passage also tells us, is characteristic of his creation. His creation was created in wisdom. But flip back with me now to Proverbs chapter 2. As we've already read of verse 5, continuing in verse 6, after inviting us to seek wisdom like silver and recognizing that that concludes in knowing the Lord, verse 6 tells us, for the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity. And so wisdom is characteristic of who God is. Wisdom is characteristic of how God created the world. And wisdom is characteristic of his work in those who seek him. He is the one who gives wisdom. Wisdom is from him. And so how do we respond rightly? Knowing that we serve the God of wisdom, that we look to him as the source of wisdom, that in everything he does, we see that there is wisdom. We respond rightly by cultivating a heart for wisdom. Another theme that we see throughout Proverbs, again, we see it, I think, 10 different times in the first 10 chapters alone, is an invitation to listen. My son, listen to my instructions. And also we see again and again in Proverbs an admonition to humility. and an invitation to seek. You know, a few hundred years ago, a very wise person, René Descartes, said this that he's famous for: I think, therefore I am. And in essence, that was an expression of humanity's attempt to wipe the slate clean of knowledge and only believe what we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And he boiled it down to, I think, therefore I am. How else can I know that I even exist? Now, in one sense, that whole philosophy led to what we would know as humanism, which in the philosophical sense, a belief in the work and the ability of man himself apart from God. But that's not really where it began. You know, the sciences and the philosophies developed as they did, not as a way to push against God, but because they were founded in the idea that God had revealed himself in an orderly way to our world. So our world could be studied. Knowledge could be studied. Wisdom could be gained because it's who God is. And in some sense, many cultures in this day, the kings would have collected wise sayings. You know, and if you think about it, it's not even foreign to our culture. What does pretty much every president do after he ends his presidency? He builds a library, a collection of knowledge and remembrances of what they accomplished. Cultivating wisdom has always been something that leaders have felt led to. But what we believe about wisdom is that we have a God who intended for his creation to know him. And so what did he do? He revealed himself to us. Think about the difference in saying if you work really hard, you can figure things out on your own, and saying that there is a God who made you, who desires you know him, and has given you the means by which you can. So we don't begin with entirely a blank slate, but we begin with the truth that God has made himself known through his word. So his word is knowable. Even as we read it now in English, translated from Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, his word is knowable because he is knowable, because that's who he has shown us who he is. He's the God who has communicated himself to us, and our invitation is to listen, to seek. You know, in our pursuit of wisdom, we will never arrive. The wiser we become, the more we will see clearly our need for the Lord. Where does wisdom begin? The fear of the Lord. How does wisdom grow? The fear of the Lord. Where does wisdom end? The fear of the Lord. And so a wise person understands the source of wisdom. Wisdom comes from the Lord. Wisdom is found in pursuing the Lord. Proverbs 8:34 says, "Blessed is the one who listens to me." This is wisdom again speaking. "Watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my door." Proverbs 12:15, "The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." And how about the invitation to seek wisdom as you would silver? To hold it as more precious than gold. We will never escape our need for the word of the Lord. That was what Eric shared that he saw in other believers' lives in Guatemala. And this leads us to ask a couple of questions at this point. Who are you listening to? Where do you go for wisdom? Are you growing in your understanding of who God has revealed himself to be in his word? Friends, a wise person understands that's where wisdom comes from. And ultimately, that's where wisdom will lead. So if the source of wisdom is God, and it's found in a right response to who he's revealed himself to be, what then is the aim? Proverbs 1:6, the epilogue or beginning gives us, or prologue, sorry, I used the words wrong. The prologue gives us a hint of where Proverbs is meant to take us. Start with me in verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning. The one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Excuse me again. What is the aim of wisdom? The aim of wisdom is to know the world. Now, when I was a soccer coach, I have one kid, I have his name in my notes, but you don't need to know his name. But he was younger than the rest of our team. I think he was faster than the rest of our team, too. He was a good athlete. He didn't live in Toma. He was from one of the surrounding towns, but he was such a good athlete. He was that kid who I described before, who tried to do it all on his own. And there were multiple times in one game in particular where he broke away from the pack. He took the ball and he took it right down the side of the field. Now what happens in soccer, even at this age? The whole other team starts to drift to him. So if he's being wise, he sees that there's no way that he can finish the play. But what happens when everybody goes this way? We have guys sitting alone in front of the net. If he had understood the game and he had not had so much trust in his ability, he could have moved the ball across the field and we would have scored multiple goals. But he'd try and finish it on his own. I saw him kick the stupid soccer ball into the side of the net like 3 times. And I told him, look, man, you can't do it on your own. And I wonder how many of us are like that in life. We keep trying, we keep striving, and it never works. You see, wisdom understands that wisdom comes from God. That's how we understand what the game even is. But the wisdom God gives to us is how the game works. We begin to understand how we might live. And looking back at 1:6-7, look at some of those words: instruction, words of insight, wise dealings, righteousness, justice, equity, prudence, knowledge, discretion, learning, guidance, understanding. One of the commentators I read described this as like a kaleidoscope. You know, where you look at the same thing, but as you turn it, you see that same thing in different ways. All of these words are giving us a picture of where wisdom takes us. We understand how things are going. They paint a picture of things like how to navigate a difficult situation. Another commentator, I loved this example. He talked about not only do the Proverbs tell us what to do, but they give us wisdom in how to deal with situations that they don't address. So think about Solomon, the expression of wisdom. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 4, 2 prostitutes come to him. You probably know the story. They both had a baby, and in the night, one had rolled over and killed her baby, so she snuck into the room of the other, replaced her baby who was not alive, and took the baby who was alive. The next day, they come to Solomon, fighting like cats and dogs for whose child the living baby's is. So Solomon turned to his book of Proverbs and found the proverb on what to do when prostitutes come and fight over the living child, and he did it. No. You see, Solomon had wisdom. And so he understood the working of a mom's heart. And you remember what he did? He honored the mom's heart by saying, fine, cut the baby in 2 and share it. Knowing that the baby whose mom that was would never let that happen. That's wisdom. It's how to navigate difficult situations. Wisdom is how to see what is right. We know those words throughout the Bible of justice, righteousness, equity. That paints a picture of growing in our understanding. Not arriving, but continuing to grow. It paints a picture of listening for what is good and what is true. And going back to chapter 2, picking back up in verse 9-15, as we understand the fear of the Lord, verse 5, and find the knowledge of God, what then does he say that results in? Then you will understand righteousness, justice, and equity, every good path, verse 9. Verse 10, for wisdom will come into your heart, knowledge will be pleasant to your soul, discretion will watch over you, understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech who forsake the path of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil, delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose past are crooked and who are devious in their ways. So what will the result of knowing God be? It will result in us understanding better how to live our lives in this world. A world that is created by God, that is good, but a world that has been deeply impacted by the reality of our sin. A fruit of drawing near to God as I grow in my understanding of how to navigate the world. Think about the book we talked about a few weeks ago that came up a few months ago in our Collision series, The Wisdom Pyramid, where it talked then about where we go for wisdom and how we ought build our wise lives. And it used the old example of the food pyramid where you talked about you need this much of this, that much of that, and he transitioned it to wisdom. And at the top of the pyramid in his wisdom pyramid was the internet, social media. And he said in some sense, that should be like that much of our pursuit of wisdom and our gaining of information. And what was at the bottom? The Word of God. And his critique was that sadly too often we flip that, right? But what the author of Proverbs is telling us is that wisdom is found in pursuing God, and in pursuing God, we grow in our understanding of how to walk well in this world. And so what is the source? The source is the fear of the Lord. What is the result? A better understanding of the world that we live in. But does Proverbs end there? You know who God is. You know about the world. In one sense, the person who stops at knowledge is not the person who Proverbs describes as wise. In fact, one of the things I loved in reading through Proverbs was all of the different Proverbs that spoke to the person who sees what needs to be done but finds some excuse not to do it. At one point it says, the sluggard says, there's a bear outside, I best not leave the house. You see, if the end of wisdom is merely knowledge, we are not truly wise, because what is the result of wisdom ultimately? Right choices. Hopefully you're still in Proverbs chapter 2. Look down to verse 20. So you will walk in the way of good and keep the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it, but the wicked will be cut off from the land, the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Now if there's a soccer player who doesn't get the game at all, and I love that soccer player because if you had a kid in soccer, I guarantee you've seen this at least once. That's the soccer player who gets the ball and takes off, and the teammates are behind him cheering. The parents are on the sideline yelling. They score a goal, and then it becomes clear that they were going to the wrong way. They don't even understand the game. If that's the soccer player who needs to understand that wisdom comes from pursuing God, wisdom grows in knowing God, and wisdom begins with or ends with an understanding of who God is, then there's the player again who knows what they're supposed to do but doesn't understand how the world works. And so they can't figure out why what they're doing doesn't work. The one who doesn't know that the result of wisdom is not merely knowledge but practice is the soccer player who doesn't ever practice. I remember the high school coach who had a son that was the same age as Timothy, so his kids were always on one of the teams. He would say that if a kid will practice 15 minutes a day handling a ball, he by high school will be better than almost every player who comes out for the team. In fact, he said that if I get a 14-year-old that doesn't know how to handle the ball, I really can't do a lot with them. I can teach a player how to do the plays. I can teach a player where to go on the field, but I can't necessarily teach what they have to learn by taking the time to learn it. You see, if we have the knowledge of what the game is, if we understand how the world works, but it doesn't change the way we live, we're not wise. In the passage we read from chapter 2, you heard in 3 different ways. Walk in the way that is good. Keep the path of the righteous. Upright will inhabit the land. The word for righteousness or the righteous one is used 73 times in the book of Proverbs. Like if we flip over to Proverbs chapter 10 and do that for just a minute. We're going to skim fast here. But Proverbs chapter 10, righteousness and the righteous one hit you in the face again and again every time you read it. Verse 2, righteousness delivers from death. Verse 3, the Lord will not let the righteous go hungry. Verse 6, blessed are the head of the righteous. Verse 7, the memory of the righteous is a blessing. Verse 11, the mouth of the righteous is a fountain for life. Skip ahead to chapter 11, verse 3. The integrity of the upright guides them. Verse 4, righteousness delivers from death. Skipping some of the examples. Verse 9, by knowledge the righteous are delivered. And who are the righteous? That word and that term, whether it be righteousness or the righteous one, refers to the one who follows the standard. And what is the standard? What is the rule? It's the one given to us by the one who made it. That's the idea of righteousness in the Old Testament. Now, incidental commercial at this point in the sermon is I flipped, not in my normal Bible that I read for my quiet times, but in a Proverbs ESV scripture journal. And we actually have a number of these available. They're $5 a piece. That sort of covers the cost, not fully. But I would encourage some of you to pick these up. What they are is essentially a copy of the Bible passage on one side and a place to take notes on the other. Going forward, these are probably something we'll have for every sermon series we do. Maybe you don't have a place to take notes, and you'd love to take notes right alongside the scripture we're studying. Bam, here it is. Maybe sometimes you would love to study your Bible with a pen or different colored pens and mark up the snot of it, like a way you don't want to do your normal Bible. It's what I do in here. Like I've got lines, I've got underlinings, I've got boxes. I wouldn't do that in here. I'm not against marking up your Bible, but I just mark this up more. Guys, these are a great tool for studying the Bible, and I'd encourage you to grab a copy and use it as we walk through this series. The other piece of my challenge for you is you may have realized there's 31 chapters in Proverbs. Now, many of our months on our calendar have 31 days. A challenge I want to give you, at least for these 2 months, is something that I try and practice in my own quiet time. I don't do it perfectly. I don't do it every day. But as you get into your quiet time, over November and December, whatever day of the month it is, my challenge is to go to that chapter of Proverbs and read it. Read a chapter a day. Now, if you do that for all of December, guess what? You'll have read the whole book. If you start now, you'll start in chapter 10. You'll get through chapter 30, because there's not 31 days in November. I checked this morning. But I learned this strategy or practice from a pastor that I had in college that I worked for about 1.5 years in Champaign-Urbana. He did this every day. So in a given year, he read through Proverbs about 12 times. He also read a psalm a day. So in a given year, every 5 months, he made it through the book of Psalms. Think about, for a 60-some-year-old pastor, what that would mean for his understanding of wisdom and who the Lord is, the cultivation of his heart for worship. Guys, my challenge is this month, read a chapter of Proverbs every day. Just add it to what you read in your quiet time. Grab one of these and write all over it. Bring it to church on Sundays. Take your notes here. They say that when you write things down, you remember something like 80% of what you hear. When you just listen, you hear something like 15%. So really, you guys only hear like 10 minutes a Sunday if you're not taking notes. So the result of wisdom, right choices, commercial over. We looked in chapter 10 and 11, and you saw righteousness and uprightness again and again and again. It's used more likely as an adjective than it is as a noun, which is telling you that the book of Proverbs is encouraging and lifting up the one who does righteousness, not just righteousness itself. It pushes past the idea that genuine wisdom is merely knowledge and sets before us wisdom as doing what is right. But there's another side to this reality, and we're moving towards our conclusion. Flip back in Proverbs to chapter 1 again. Now, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 20 is the first time that wisdom speaks to us. And it invites us to come to it. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But look at verse 24. Because I have called and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel and have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then you will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Because they hated knowledge, did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel, despised all of my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their ways and have the fill of their own devices. We could finish that out, but it's the same idea. The author of Proverbs is an invitation to us in our foolishness to listen But don't be mistaken. There is a cost to not listening. You know, when I was a youth pastor, one of the checkpoints I would use with our students, they would hear it at least once a year, was pursue God in all of your choices, because your choices determine your path. Friends, one of the realities of the wisdom of Proverbs is that each and every one of us is building something with the choices we make. And here's my question. Do you want to live in what you're building? Is that where you want your life to be lived out? There's an example that I heard once. I'm not even sure it's a true story, but there was a dad who owned a construction company, and he was preparing to travel. He was getting up in age, and so he invited his son who worked for him to take charge of a house they had to build. And so his son took control. His dad gave him the plans, he gave him the money, and he left. The son got to building, and he realized that there were a lot of ways he could cut costs, a lot of ways he could keep the money. And so he built the house, but he built it cheaply. He built the house, but it was not something he would ever want to live in. And so his dad returns, the house is done, and he walks his dad through the house, and from the outside, it looks great, but only the son knows what's really beneath the cover, so to speak. And as they conclude their walk through of the house, the dad turns to him, hands him the keys, and says, "Son, it's yours." Now, I don't know if that story is true or not, but think about the reality of what our choices are doing. You see, some of us are living in the homes our choices have made, and it's hard. It is not a place where we are finding life. But here's the good news of Proverbs. Proverbs does not say, well, then I guess you're done. You made your bed, now lie in it. Proverbs is an invitation. Flip back to verse 20 of chapter 1. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? Turn just one more time to Proverbs chapter 8. Verse 4, to you, O men, I call. My cry is to the children of man. O simple one, learn prudence. O fools, learn sense. Hear, for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is right. Friends, the invitation of Proverbs is no matter where you are at, you are invited to pursue knowledge and knowing God. You are invited to have His word so that He will teach you how the world actually is. And He will give you a picture of how you were intended to live. You see, Proverbs is ultimately about experiencing the joy of knowing God, of tasting the goodness of His wisdom, and ultimately the goodness of trusting His word in our choices. So guys, if you've ever played a card game, if you've ever played a sport, don't you want to know the point? Can you picture starting to learn a different game with people who've played it before, and at first you're like, I don't even know what's happening. You want to know how to play. That's the first thing. And typically, once you kind of know the outcome of the game, then you start to work on how to win. How does it really work? And ultimately, the goal of knowing how it really works is so that you'll win. I don't really like playing games to lose. And we do all of those things to play a game, to be on a sports team. Proverbs is about something much more significant. It doesn't just give us wise information. Proverbs calls you to be wise. Proverbs offers you God's perspective of the world that He created, with the ultimate goal of helping you, follower of Jesus, knowing how you might live. Let's close in a word of prayer as we enter into a time of communion as a body. Jesus, we just thank you for this time and your word. And we thank you for the book of Proverbs that invites us to be wise. My prayer this morning and going forward in this season is that we will listen. But Jesus, we thank you that in one sense, if we wanted a picture of what Proverbs looked like in real life, there's no better picture than you. You entered into this world and you pursued your Father. You said everything He told you to say. You did everything he told you to do, even to the point of offering up your body to be broken, your blood to be shed, so that in you we might find life. As we, as your people, gather this morning to remember the life that is ours because of you, Jesus, we thank you for this opportunity. And we ask that you would shape us now as you've shaped us around your word, around the reality of the hope of the gospel in this remembrance. We pray this, Jesus, in your name.